Oops. Hello everyone. Hopefully, for some reason my screen is going. There we go. Right. Hello. My name's Laura Aitken-Burt. I'm one of the authors of the Knowing World History series. And today I'm going to be talking about globalizing the Reformation by trying to input the Aztecs and Ottomans into the units about the Reformation that no doubt you probably already teach in year 7 or year 8. And these link to book 2, the blue one of the new early modern British and world history textbooks. So to think about the Reformation and things that you might already be studying kind of, the classic things that are often in a Reformation inquiry. Of course, in British schools, usually that is focused around Henry VIII and the break with Rome. So if we're thinking about trying to input other countries into that story, you've got Britain and kind of Italy there. You might do a little bit about the Renaissance, for example. And of course, with the Protestant Reformation, you might look at Germany and Martin Luther, the Johannes Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press, and no doubt the Spanish Armada as well. So we've got quite a lot of the kind of European countries involved in a Reformation inquiry. But there are ways that we can make that Reformation inquiry much bigger in ways that we probably, are links that can be made quite easily, but perhaps people are not quite sure about what content they could add. So, as I just said, often we are focusing on Britain in existing inquiries you might have on this topic in relation to Henry VIII. We might then look at Rome. You might then look at Germany and Martin Luther, and Spain for the Spanish Armada. You probably might reference the Field of the Cloth of Gold and Francis I, the kind of rivalry with Henry VIII and Francis. And if you go into the Elizabeth unit, I know a lot of teachers have started to input more inquiries about early colonies in North America. And if we're talking about colonization in North America, then that might include West Africa and the beginnings of the enslavement. But we've also got Spain involved during the Reformation to try and increase their power by conquering Mesoamerica and South America. And that very easily does fit into a Reformation inquiry, particularly because part of the reason for the initiation of the Spanish Armada is also because Francis Drake is capturing all that gold from Spanish ships that are coming over from the conquest of the Aztecs. And we've also got the Ottomans, who are the kind of, main rivals in Europe, of course, an Islamic empire. And Britain, when the break with Rome happens, there is kind of a potential ally available there. But we've actually got France ending up allying with the Ottomans at points as well. So there's a really interesting dynamic also going on with a neighboring empire. And I'm kind of going to question about whether the Ottomans should be part of any European history anyway, based on kind of the territories that they are involved in. And also you can pivot that inquiry with the Ottomans to also look at the Safavids in Iran as well. So essentially, I'm going to spend about 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes on the Aztec Inca inquiry, and then 15, 20 minutes on the Ottomans, and then I'll happily take any questions. Please do put them in the chat or in the Q&A. The Collins team will let me know if anyone's writing anything, and at the end we'll go over anything. So please do, let me know your feedback. So our first unit, our first chapter in our Americas unit starts with the Maya city-states, and this is a really good place to start because the Maya are actually a much older civilization, but the peoples of the Mayan city-states still exist into the early modern period. They've just kind of their empire has kind of collapsed in favor of the Aztecs by the early modern period, but it gets students kind of starting to understand what the geography of Mesoamerica is like, particularly this very tropical landscape, the different types of goods and foods and things that you might be able to see. And there's such fantastic archaeology that you can look at from these Maya cities, so like Palenque, Tikal, Chichen Itza, the stepped pyramids in the kind of rainforests are very vivid and really good site studies to look at as well. We've also got a mythology that you can look at, which might be a good way to think about other kind of museum objects. For example, the British Museum has some Mayan panels that you might want to use as source material. The Popol Vuh is the kind of mythological narrative that survives from the Maya city states, mainly about the hero twins and them trying to overcome the Lords of Tribalba. Which, if they are doing any or have done previously any kind of ancient history, kind of Greek and Roman classical stuff, potentially that's quite an interesting kind of comparison there in terms of a polytheistic religion. Ulamalitsi is the famous ball game, the big rubber balls and the big ball courts, which are in many of these sites like Palenque and Tikal. There are lots of kind of rumors about, you may have heard that people get sacrificed if they win win those games. That's kind of quite disputed, not necessarily being sacrificed if they win or if they lose. It's kind of a little bit unclear, but I'll get to sacrifice shortly. And it's very important in this first chapter to set up the distinction between Mayan and Nahuatl, which are actually two different languages. So the Aztecs did not speak Mayan, they spoke Nahuatl as a language. And I think, yeah, the ideas of like obsidian blades, again, there's some really good examples in the British Museum that you can use as sources here. And these Tzompatli kind of skull rack reliefs that are from some of the set pyramids in the Maya city-states are quite interesting to look at as well. But I'll get back to sacrifice in a second. So after you've kind of like established the geography of Mesoamerica and looking at where the Maya city-states are and taking a look at some of these great sites, I always use Google Earth actually is a really nice way to, in the classroom, kind of actually explore as if you are there on the big screen. So there's Palenque. Here's one of the skull racks as well. And then you move on to talk about the rise of the Aztecs, a slightly later civilization, which actually come from the southern states of North America. They are known as the Mexica, so an X in Nahuatl is actually like a kind of sh sound, which is eventually where the name Mexico later comes from, but they referred to themselves as the Mexica. And they come down from kind of North America into this Mesoamerica region based on a kind of myth that an eagle landed on a prickly cactus in the middle of Lake Texcoco, and that was a sign from the gods that that was where they should build their capital city. And that city is Tenochtitlan, which is fascinating. Get another really good site study to use, even though that is now modern Mexico City, so nothing really survives from Tenochtitlan. There are some interesting kind of illustrations, artistic illustrations of what it might have looked like. It was said to be kind of as big as any of the other kind of larger cities like Constantinople, for example. They think that might have had 50 to 100,000 inhabitants. And another kind of like fun fact for students is that the eagle, this kind of myth of the eagle and the prickly cactus is actually what is now in the center of the modern Mexican flag. So I think it's quite important to use the right kind of terminology when we're talking about these different civilizations. So Tlatoani actually means speaker in the Aztec world, but that's essentially the leader of the Aztecs, or the king, let's say. And they were known for wearing their very elaborate headdresses made from green quetzal feathers of birds, and we often have quite interesting discussions in class about that actually being kind of more valuable to have these iridescent green feathers rather than a gold crown for a place that has a kind of abundance of gold. Actually, kind of there are other goods that are rarer and therefore more valuable. The Kwapili are the eagle nobles, so they're like the warriors who had to achieve 20 remarkable deeds of bravery in order to kind of gain more like hierarchical, like they go higher up the Aztec hierarchy. Again, that's kind of quite interesting if you've no doubt already done kind of feudal system and this kind of thing in your year 7 medieval inquiries. Another kind of like interesting fact about the Aztecs are actually one of the first empires or the states to introduce state education for both girls and boys, and no matter what class they're in as well. So everyone got some kind of education in the Aztec Empire. And I said I was going to come back to sacrifice. I mean, I think that the Aztecs, particularly if students have done anything about Mesoamerica at primary school, there's often quite an emphasis on sacrifice and the kind of like gory nature of it and the kind of vein of horrible histories and this kind of thing. And I think it's quite important to think quite carefully about how that's being presented. And a really excellent book by Camilla Townsend called Fifth Son, which came out a couple of years ago, is really good at talking about this. And to actually really try and recenter this into to try and understand a different worldview about what sacrifice means, and to compare it a little bit more with some other practices that we talk about in relation to European practices at the time. If you think about flagellation, for example, medieval priests and this kind of thing, or bloodletting as a medical practice at this time, things that are deemed quite gory are perhaps there are more kind of like similarities there, and an actual full sacrifice of humans with this kind of heart being sort of taken out of the body and thrown down the steps and all of this. Often, the vast majority of those stories are coming from Spanish source material. So it's really, really interesting to try and get students to really think about, well, where is this story coming from? Why would they want to overemphasize this? And in the context of the Reformation, that's of course even more important. When again, you've got plenty of killing going on with burning at the stake and all of this in relation to various different sections of Christianity. If Spain is trying to convert the new areas that they're conquering, it's within their interest to emphasize that they are uncivilized and all this. So actually, what it seems that there's no doubt that human sacrifice did happen, but it seems that it probably escalated in intensity as the Aztecs gained more and more power. And so you can actually kind of look at it as a form of imperial control, like violence within imperial control, which you'll no doubt come back to in relation to the British Empire and other inquiries, as well as a kind of interesting similarity there. And it's important to talk about this in relation to the way in which the Aztecs are relating to their neighboring their neighboring city-states, because this is going to be highly important for the when Cortez arrives. So yeah, these kind of very, very famous gory images of the sacrifice happening are from this is from an Aztec codex, but it's being very much kind of filtered through Spanish conversion and all of this kind of thing, and Tenochtitlan there on the left as a kind of brilliant city on the water, amazing kind of a little bit like Venice potentially, with like lots of canals and this kind of thing. And there you go, there's the amazing headdress that potentially Moctezuma II wore, which has survived. So over to the Inca Empire now. So we're moving south down into Peru and the Andes. So this is a very different landscape, and I think it's quite important to emphasize that with students. It's much higher up. And famously, the Inca did not have any wheels. They didn't have any need for wheels for transporting things, and instead used the alpacas and llamas because of the kind of like steep inclines in the Andes. There's a much more kind of nature-based emphasis on religion here. So kind of the sun and the moon being important and worshipped as kind of spirits within the natural landscape. And the Coricancha is a ceremony where the biggest temple in Cuzco, which housed the kind of silver and gold leaf little statues, which were said to represent the sweat of the sun and the tears of the moon. Again, you can bring in these ideas of imperial control with the Inca and think about how the Sapa Inca, or the kind of main Inca, the King Inca, actually controlled their people. So there's an interesting system called the Mita, where for a certain number of days each year, people were essentially conscripted to work for the state to actually complete construction projects, and they do a kind of amount of service each year, and they kind of collected maize and the kind of like main key crops as well, and kind of like centralized resources for redistribution, which is quite interesting. And the Capacocha ceremony is when boys and girls were selected from across the Inca Empire and had to walk along special lines all the way to Cuzco, to the final to the Coricancha temple, and were supposedly sacrificed. But again, that's kind of disputed about how often this is happening. Is this kind of a kind of overemphasized story? It's no doubt that it did happen, but the kind of regularity of it is a bit disputed. And we've got mummification as well which has happened for thousands of years in the Andes mountains, actually older than many ancient Egyptian mummies at the time, because the altitude kind of is able to preserve the bodies. The Aklakuna, so this is an example of trying to think about what young women are doing in the Inca Empire. So they are kind of part of Aklakuna means chosen women, so they are living in kind of temple convents. Again, a kind of interesting potential comparison that you could make with the kind of convent system at this time in Britain as well, and monasteries and this kind of thing. Or again, if you've done any kind of ancient parallels, you could think about things like the Vestal Virgins in Rome as a similarity. The Inca did not have a written language, so instead they used a script of writing called quipu, which is actually knots on pieces of string. So this is a really interesting way to get students to think about, why are things written down, and do they have to be written down, or can we, communicate in different forms of communication if you understand, if you understand a different script, if you understand how to read these quipu strings, then does that kind of like serve the same function? And again, there's some interesting examples that have been preserved as well that could be looked at source material. And again, just thinking about different types of goods that have been produced in the Andes in comparison to the Maya and the Aztecs. So we've got things like coca and chicha beer, like a type of drink beer type thing, and shamans who often ate these things which have hallucinogenic properties in them as well. And the kind of the making of the chicha drink is quite important for the later story about Pizarro. So the unit's being constructed so that you really get to explore these American civilizations in their own right, and to try and understand them as separate entities before you even start to think about what happens with the European colonization, and to really try to disrupt that traditional narrative that their conquest was somewhat inevitable, which is often the kind of phrasing that seems to come into the classroom from what students know from, popular culture or potentially from primary school, to really try and think about these as civilizations that do have forms of control. They are empires. There were no doubt people who resisted both the Aztecs and the Inca as rulers and overbearing rulers in themselves, and that they had ways that were very similar of either religious practices, even if it's polytheistic, and of course like different in many different ways, to try and, again, yeah, like just I think in disrupting that traditional narrative is quite important here. So after you've kind of explored those three empires themselves in their own right, you can then turn to thinking about what happens with the colonization process. So obviously Machu Picchu is a site, some people might have even been there, either teachers or students. But interestingly, actually, this was already abandoned by the time that the Spanish got there. It seems like it was some kind of like palatial residence. It wasn't really a place where loads and loads of people lived in the Inca Empire. Really, the capital is Cusco. And there's an artist reconstruction of the Quipu and Manco Capac, who was the first Sapa Inca of the Inca Empire. So I think Cortez is going to arrive on the scene as the European that actually is going against his orders from Cuba, where he kind of like runs away from, basically. By the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, is kind of wanting him to stay, but he's like, I'm going to go. Has this kind of idea of himself being a hero, and going back to what I was saying previously about the Aztecs actually being an empire in themselves, the Tlaxcalans are one of these groups who are actually subjugated by the Aztecs. Now, this is really important for when Cortez is going through the Yucatan Mayan Peninsula, and he starts to come across these different groups. And when he comes to the Tlaxcalan group, initially they are just going to kill him and his men, right? He's a stranger going through the rainforest. But we have Malintzin, this enslaved girl who is able to speak both Mayan and Nahuatl. And because she can do that, she can therefore kind of like translate between these different groups. And she kind of manages to also teach herself some Spanish as well. That she convinces the Tlaxcalans to actually ally with Cortez. Now that gives Cortez a huge number of troops to help support him in his then kind of like arrival into Tenochtitlan. And again, I think it's really important to think about the fact that the Aztecs did initially kind of welcome Cortez like they would any other kind of like client state, thinking that he was someone that had come to give tribute to them, right? Like to Moctezuma II, he thought, well, like this guy has come to give me praise, let's say. And when that appears to not be the case, when Moctezuma is taken hostage, there is resistance to the Spanish staying there. And Cortez actually leaves because he needs to go back to Cuba because Velasquez is trying to arrest him. And he manages to convince the people who have come, the 11 ships that come to try and take Cortez back, he manages to convince those groups to come back with him to Tenochtitlan. In his absence, though, the Aztecs have actually managed to kick out the Spanish who were there, and it's known as La Noche Triste in Spanish, like the Night of Tears. But that does show and again disrupts that narrative that the Aztecs were unable to resist or unable to kind of do anything against this invasion from the Spanish. And then we start to get students to try and think about and inquire about, well, then what is it? Like, is it, this kind of traditional idea that they had, weaponry, or there's another kind of story that Moctezuma thought that Cortez was a god and all of this, which again seems to all be from Spanish source material. It's smallpox, okay, and destroys about 95% of the population. And so when the reinforcements come, the Aztecs have essentially been decimated, and it's partly because of that then the transatlantic and trans-Pacific slave trade as well with the Philippines, which the Spanish also later conquer. They start to bring people to Mesoamerica because the Aztecs are no longer there. And these source materials are really interesting. I mean, the one on the right there is a facsimile of an actual manuscript, but you can see that Mallinson, this female character, is right there at the center, as in that kind of later painting on the left there of the kind of meeting of Cortes and Moctezuma. So they're quite good sources to get students to think about who's important in this story, and really without Mallinson would Cortes manage to have negotiated the alliance with the Tlaxcalans, etc. And so Pizarro is, chronologically after the conquest of Tenochtitlan, and actually gets quite inspired by Cortez's story. So they are kind of, somewhat connected. And actually, it's the smallpox that has already decimated the Aztecs that goes down into South America and causes a civil war for the Inca. So when we've got civil war going on, because the Emperor Huayna Capac died from smallpox, and his two sons, Huascar and Atahualpa, are at war with each other, and Atahualpa ends up kind of winning that civil war. But it means that by the time Pizarro actually arrives, there is already much division amongst the Incas themselves, which he can therefore then exploit. There are interesting examples of cultural misunderstanding. So a Jesuit priest is brought with Pizarro, and he brings a Bible, which Atahualpa, again, in these kind of stories, kind of dramatically throws it to the ground, thinking that it was not a very good gift to give to him. But then equally, he offers the Spanish some chicha drink, which is very important for the Inca, and they throw that on the ground because they don't like it. So, interesting thinking about kind of the interaction between these two different cultures. You can see that again the links with Europe, because they try to burn Atahualpa at the stake, but that would destroy his body, which would usually for Inca kings would need to be mummified. So he insists that he needs to be strangled, and they want to try and convert him as well. So again, linking to ideas of the Reformation, Counter-Reformation. And again, there's a really good important story of resistance here, that whilst Pizarro kind of, does kill Atahualpa, the younger brother of Atahualpa, who's only 18 at the time, Manco II, is installed as like a puppet ruler, but he actually kind of escapes from Pizarro and ends up founding a neo-Inca state, which starts a guerrilla war in the Andes Mountains, which is very hard for the Spanish to kind of conquer for many decades. It's not until 1572, and again you then see the divisions happening between Pizarro and his men as well. So these again some interesting sources. One from a manuscript, but another one a kind of artist's illustration. Okay, so Ottomans. So the Ottomans are, again, part of this Reformation story, and they link to other things which you may have studied previously as well. So you may have in Year 7 done the Crusades, for example, and you may have talked about the Byzantines, you may have talked about Constantinople as well. So we're returning to a city that students may already know about, and that's really important for continuity and to think about how things are changing around the world. And if you've done Tenochtitlan first, or vice versa, if you do the Ottoman unit first, as I said, kind of, you could compare the cities of Tenochtitlan, Constantinople, and London, for example, or any other city, and you can think about the kind of differences there. And Mehmed II is a young, only 19 when he becomes Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and he is convinced that he needs to ensure that he conquers Constantinople, since many groups had tried to conquer it since its foundation in the 4th century and been unsuccessful. He thinks this is a way that he can finally finish off the Byzantine Empire and gain the kind of glory not only for the Ottomans, but also to legitimize himself as a ruler amongst the European elites. This again links into other ideas about the Renaissance and technological innovations that are also happening at this time, because he is using, he's having siege warfare, but with the biggest cannon ever seen at that time. That's meant to supposedly 9 meters long and needed 60 oxen to pull it. In order to try and destroy the famous walls of Constantinople. Another good site that you can look at is the Hagia Sophia, which is is an amazing building in the center of Constantinople. You can think about how important it was for the Byzantines as a place of worship, and how it eventually gets turned into a mosque when Mehmed takes it over. And it's just a great story, like the siege of Constantinople, the way that to get around the chains that go across the Bosphorus. He actually kind of drags all of these boats. Mehmed drags all these boats onto the other side, so then the Byzantines wake up the next morning and suddenly all the Ottoman boats are on the other side of the chain. So yeah, students kind of find that quite an interesting story to think about. And again, if you have done any classical references at other points, it's really interesting that Mehmed wants to refer himself to himself as Caesar, right? So he calls himself Kaiser-i Rum, or Caesar of Rome, because Constantinople was technically still the Eastern Roman Empire at this time. So I mentioned this at the very beginning, that I think that the Ottomans are actually very much a part of European history and are kind of often ignored, which is interesting considering that they were considered so important during the early modern period. Is that, the vast majority of foreign policy is actually involved in concerns about the Ottomans during the early modern period. But I think sometimes we only hear about them later on as the kind of sick man of Europe, but that's very much a kind of 19th century perspective, whereas in the early modern period, they're very much a threat to the other European countries. So again, good maps that you can use. You can look at buildings and things around Constantinople, again, using Google Earth and this kind of stuff. And there's Mehmed II. And then we've got Suleiman the Magnificent, an interesting kind of person to compare with Charles V, Francis I, and Henry VIII. I often put pictures of all of them together and think about how they're trying to use similar ways of clothing, apart from the kind of onion dome turban that is famous for Suleiman's image in this very famous painting here. He actually, most of the silks and things that people like Henry VIII are wearing in those famous Hans Holbein paintings are coming from the Ottoman Empire. So that makes a really, really interesting connection. The famous ambassador's picture, for example, I mean, that's just full of Ottoman objects. But we often look at it as just a kind of Tudor painting. But actually, there's a Turkish rug on the floor, and there's so much that you could link from something that you're already probably using, and the Ottomans can be put in there quite easily. So yeah, Suleiman, known as the Magnificent because of his conquests, but the Siege of Vienna is another interesting story because we were probably no doubt we wouldn't doubt that Vienna was part of Europe, and that is how far the Ottoman Empire expanded to, right? So I think it's really important for getting students to think about why these distinctions have been made and what that maybe means, or what they're trying to get at with that. The millet system is, again, another interesting way to think about ways to deal with a cosmopolitan society. So, and again, linking to the Reformation, this is really important. Like, a lot of the refugees that are coming from places like Spain with the Reconquista that, were being really, really strict about different forms of Protestantism, or also with Jewish communities, they are fleeing to the Ottoman Empire because they are allowed to practice their religions and have their own courts of law if they were cases not involving Muslims, and they were allowed to follow their own customs as well. So the kind of Ottoman state allows them to exist in a way that kind of different forms of religion in Europe at this time are much more heavily kind of policed. Again, really interesting kind of sites and things that you can look at. You've got the Soleimani Mosque in Istanbul that was built by Suleiman. You've got more things about education that you can talk about, and hammams, and the madrasas, and the artistic societies that Suleiman promotes as well, which again makes interesting links with Henry if you're doing a study that is particularly focused on art, or to link with the Renaissance as well that you may be doing. And there is actually a Franco-Ottoman alliance that happens, which again, if you're already talking about France, well, then why not include the Ottomans in this story? And equally, we know that Akbar, if you have a Mughals unit in your Year 8 inquiry, then we know that Suleiman and Akbar the Great were exchanging letters with each other, so you can include them there. So yeah, there's Suleiman, there's the Soleimani Mosque. Again, they're such beautiful kind of like places to think about and look at. This really complicates the narrative about the Ottomans, because whilst we might think, or the kind of, again, traditional narrative, if you were going to talk about the Ottomans, was to think about them as a threat. How much of a threat were they to Europe? Well, the Ottomans are actually less concerned about Europe, and they're much more concerned about Safavid Persia. And I think it's really useful to think about the Ottomans and the Safavids as a similar kind of like Reformation-esque division that's going on in Islam itself as well. So it being, the difference between Sunni and Shia religious practices and empires trying to build on that and therefore gain more power because of those religious differences. So it's, kind of a really interesting way to bring that in to a Reformation inquiry. And again, you've got fantastic sites like Isfahan that you can look at as well, which again, fantastic architecture to look at. And we also know that Elizabeth I, which you will definitely be talking about, actually writes letters throughout her reign to Murad III, trying to increase ties, because they think, well, actually we can use the metals and things that have been taken from Catholic churches with the dissolution of the monasteries and sell it to the Ottomans so that they can make weaponry for their wars against both Spain and the Safavids. So again, the Ottomans are actually in this story without, even if we're not kind of talking about them often. So yeah, we've got like some fantastic kind of manuscripts that you can look at, like the Shamana painted manuscripts where you've got good pictures of the Shahs, and you've got the Shah Mosque there, and there's Nakshi Jahan Square, which still looks like that. It's pretty impressive. The Ottoman-Venetian Wars are really interesting to think about how successful they actually are. So there's a lot of propaganda from the West about particularly the Battle of Lepanto. And when I've talked about this with students, they've found it like basically like a really big loss actually for the European countries, because the Ottomans actually kind of just they don't lose any land with the Battle of Lepanto. It's actually just the first time that the Europeans have kind of won any kind of battle against them. And supposedly the Grand Vizier Sokulu Mehmed Pasha responds, well, when we took Cyprus, we cut off one of your arms. You defeated our fleet, which meant nothing more than shaving our beard. It's interesting to think about different interpretations of similar events if you look at different source material there. The early modern period it's just the Ottoman Venetian Wars go on for 200 years, and there's several of them, and you might also want to talk about piracy and other forms of enslavement that are going on there, like North African slavery, Christian slavery via the Barbary Corsairs, which might be quite interesting to link with other enslavement issues. And I always like talking about the Parthenon exploding as well as such an iconic monument. As you can probably tell, I've mentioned quite a lot of architectural monuments and things. I'm an archaeologist, so I do like a good site study. But yeah, this great kind of print here shows how the Parthenon was originally a mosque, and the Ottomans had put all the gunpowder inside there, thinking, well, they're never going to blow up the Parthenon, and the Venetian general on the Philippopoulos Hill just fired a cannon right at it and exploded, and that's why it has the shape it has today. And finally, Ottoman society. So again, a really nice site study that you can do about Topkapi Palace, and a great museum as well, that you can use objects that are still held there. I think there's some really interesting cultural differences that you can bring out to think about how society operates in quite a different way in order to ensure this kind of imperial control. And again, if you're thinking about imperial control, different forms of imperial control, this one is another kind of like interesting one that you can use. So the Janissaries are the elite troops, and actually the first modern standing army in Europe, which were highly feared. They had kind of some of the first rifles, for example, and they are actually they are made up from enslaved children from often Christian families in the Balkans who are taken. The children are taken away to serve as janissaries. So it is a form of enslavement, but the janissaries are able to gain quite a lot of political power and get quite close to the Sultan. So it's a different form of enslavement. And again, there's concubinage going on as well from the areas of the the different areas of the Ottoman Empire where people are forcibly taken from different areas. But because there are no racial codes, actually every sultan is essentially born from an enslaved woman from a different part of the empire. And so there's kind of like, I mean, I don't want to say power because it's obviously not if you're enslaved, but the way in which different groups could have forms of influence that would have been unthinkable in the transatlantic trade, for example. And also there are some interesting cases like Hurrem Sultan and Qasim Sultan are two interesting women who gain a lot of power over certain sultans as well, which if you again want to kind of make sure that women are inputted into your inquiries, this is a useful unit as well. So just final couple of pictures here. Again, loads of really interesting prints and things you can use to recognize the janissaries. They've got this very distinctive red coat and hat. Here are the Hurrem Sultan and Qasim Sultan and Topkapi Palace as well. So I'm conscious of time, so I don't know whether we want to go to Q&A now, to be honest. I'm not sure if Sarah.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, that sounds good. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
That was fascinating. We can share the slides with
Mhm.
attendees afterwards, so
Yeah.
yeah, they can go back and recap.
Sure.
But yeah, it's been really interesting and some great ideas for exploring all of those societies. I did not know that the Inca did not have any wheels,
Yeah.
so that's my takeaway from today. Um,
Well, I hope
um,
that was a good overview for everyone because I know that some people might know quite a bit about these two civilizations, but they're not often taught in Key Stage 3, which is why we wanted to input them into these second edition versions of these books. And I think they can fit in really well and easily, and they actually go with things that we're probably already talking about anyway. So hopefully I've helped to draw that out. But yeah, go to the questions. Go.
Thank you. Okay, so we have had some questions in the Q&A. Um, you have sort of spoken a little bit about this. Actually, maybe this was asked a little bit earlier in the presentation. Um, Sort of, would you teach the topics you've discussed through a decolonial lens? If so, how would you approach this?
Uh, well, yes. I mean, so I think that the part of the way that you do that is by ensuring that these societies are discussed as separate like units in themselves. So you're not just, sorry, I know that sometimes I was kind of like comparing them with England and this kind of thing, just for clarity for people about where they could fit into the curriculum. But, we just kind of like launch in with Aztecs as one of our kind of, new half-term units. And I think what's been so good, my class did an essay that was what was the most significant turning point in early modern the early modern world or early modern Europe or something. And we like students could then talk about anything they'd done over the year, and we saw them input like Aztecs and Ottomans into things to do with the Reformation. And I think that's really like an interesting way to do that, yeah, so hopefully I've answered that question.
And how do you avoid othering cultures when teaching about non-European civilizations? Sort of links to that question.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, in my view, it's to kind of treat them as their own individual, like societies within themselves, not just talking about them when they happen to kind of have contact with Britain, for example, or just talking about them when they have contact with Europe, but actually to do an inquiry that is looking at them as like you would do with any other society, which you are doing, right? Like as a teacher. With other units. So hopefully kind of the content that we have in these textbooks helps to give that kind of background. And again, I always think source material is quite key. And even with the Aztec sources, depending on what you're using, thinking about whether they are actually ultimately Spanish sources is an interesting kind of analytical interpretations point to help students to do that analysis and to really think about these decolonial lenses and to make sure that that othering is not happening.
Yeah, fascinating. You did talk a bit about the idea of, you know, who is truly important in the stories and the sources, and how that can really change how you view a source or just how you're talking about a particular topic. So how do you help your students think about the importance of the provenance of the sources?
So I mean, kind of classic thing that I'm not sure if everyone does this, but I often get them to think about content, nature, origin, and purpose, and just to always try and pick that out. And I always explain to them that understanding why something was created or why someone wrote something is the hardest thing for a historian to try to get to, and often requires inference, but that you can make educated guesses about it by looking at who is writing and where they are writing and when they're writing and what's happened before and after and this kind of thing. So you can do that with any of this source material, just like you would with other source material in your inquiries. And again, in these textbooks, we've got a big integrated timeline right at the back as well, so that you can see where different events that are discussed within the separate units actually interlink with the kind of like other main events that you might already be studying too, which can help with thinking about provenance in relation to when things are written, for example.
Just to say that we also do have those timelines as posters that you could download. So when we send the recording round, we can include a link to those as well. That could be something to display in your classroom. Okay, thank you, Laura. Looking at the questions, actually, this is another one on the sources. Are you looking mostly at sort of contemporary primary sources, or are you looking at later scholarship with these units as well?
Well, at the moment, at my current school, we have like very strange exam papers that we're doing because we do IGCSEs and they, for some reason, don't really have that much emphasis on sources and interpretations. But I always want to try and bring them in. But if you are doing the kind of domestic GCSE, you know, there's definitely both that you can use for this. Again, as with any other historical time period, but I know that like these units are, you know, you might not know exactly what books to go to. So I mean, I recommend the Camilla Townsend Fifth Son book for anything to do with the Aztecs is really superb. Like she talks about the source material, she talks about who these Nahuatl sources are. She actually speaks Nahuatl, so she's managed to kind of decode a lot of this stuff that's just laid like unlooked at for a long time. And is it Mark Bayer who's just again, I think it was like last year came out Khan's Caesar's Caliphs, which is about the Ottomans as well. So those are kind of like two recent books which will give you interesting kind of interpretation stuff and talk about sources as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more, and then I can hand back over to you to wrap up if there's anything else you'd like to add. So we have one here. Do you have any advice if a teacher is keen to add new topics, such as the ones you've talked about, but is meeting some resistance in their school?
Yeah, the perpetual issue. And I know also like the problem is also timing, isn't it? Like, you know, how do you fit all of this? You know, it'd be great to talk about all these things. And my answer is always, oh, they should do more history. As I'm sure everyone on this webinar probably thinks the same. In that case, I often do it a little bit like more subliminally with a bit more of, as I said, like if you're looking at a photograph of the Hans Holbein painting of Henry VIII, for example, we just ask questions about it, like you would to analyze a source anyway, and you will eventually just get to like the Ottomans anyway. Or, you know, like you can look at a map and be like, well, what's going on over there? And so even in the course of a discussion in class that objectively looks like it's you know, kind of quite standard, you can still input at least reference to them. I also often do things as projects. So that was another kind of like good thing about these textbooks. I'm not sure if people on the webinar are using them or not, but they have all of the British units as well as the world units within the same book. And the hope with that is that there'll also be kind of like grassroots movements from students. And I've had that, I had some students who were like, why are we not doing the Japan unit? And I was like, we don't have time. But I got them to do their own like little project. So they read the chapter and then they made a little presentation about it. So, like you could do it that way around as well, kind of encourage historical research and that kind of thing, and the enthusiasm from the students too, in that way. But as I said, in my opinion, it comes up anyway, because if you're doing Spanish Armada, where's the gold coming from that Francis Drake is taking? Like, it's there. Like the story is already there somewhat. But I know that would kind of go against what I was saying in terms of treating the societies in their own right. But if your time is limited, there are still ways that you can make reference to these wider global issues going on, which might provoke more interest and can be set as a kind of extension homework, for example.
Great, thank you. Okay, last question. What's the impact, what has been the impact of teaching the global history units with your students? Like, how have they reacted? And you spoke a little bit about that then, but
yeah, so this was actually my kind of like last bit, so I could do this bit.
Go for it.
Yeah. So yeah, I've kind of like I've split this into kind of 4 different things, having taught these things about what I feel have been the challenges, but also the opportunities. So with myths, I think the main challenge is that dominant kind of narrative and actually accessing the source material, where is it, and that kind of thing, particularly if they're in other languages. But the opportunities here are that you can really try and widen perspectives, get a different narrative on there by getting students to really be critical about some of these dominant narratives. Well, why do you think that? Where is that evidence coming from? Or you think the Spanish have better armor, but like, obsidian blade can cut you as much as metal, or what I mean? Like, it's kind of it helps their analytical skills as well by doing this. And you can also think about interpretations changing through time as well, which again, depending on if you're thinking about exam things later on, that is quite important about why did people push this narrative in the 19th century, for example? Well, because there are empires that like they're trying to delegitimize things. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can build on that. Vocabulary, I often find, is I would say if students were going to say one thing that they find sometimes a little bit difficult about these units, it would be like the kind of complicated Aztec spelling, and obviously there's non-Latin scripts if you're looking at China or Aztecs or Islamic countries as well, and like how to spell them, although often they are just spelled how they kind of sound. But again, the opportunities, I think, you just treat them like as keywords, like you would with many other keywords that students don't know. Like I'm sure other words that we do in medieval units that are English words, like fealty or something, if you're talking about, or dissolution of the monarchy. There are words that we do use that are not part of students' normal vocabulary. So there's no reason why these other units, like even though they are from other cultures, that we shouldn't use those words. And I think it is really important for accuracy and for them to kind of respect them as entities within themselves as well. And it makes their writing obviously sound so much better. I think, yeah, again, having new voices is a useful thing from this, but we can, someone just mentioned about department resistance. That's definitely an issue, particularly if certain staff members have been teaching it one way for a very long time, or is there an issue of presentism that we're trying to, make things more or less impressive or something than they actually were, or finding that source material that actually doesn't already have that prejudice kind of embedded in it. But I think that, yeah, as I said, like you just get students to critique it. And I think, to be honest, like thinking forward about what the future of history teaching is in schools, I do think it is critical thinking. It is the subject that is best placed to help students to navigate their online life and the source material that they engage with, to ask those questions about why was this thing written or made, or how can we work out whether it's reliable. And just to mention that I run a kind of research group with my students called Athena Society Official. So do take a look at that website, where we're trying to find kind of women in history. And this has kind of provoked that as well, with students wanting to find out more about Mallinson and this kind of stuff. So there's a journal that schools can contribute to that. And yeah, like how to integrate it into the teaching. There's always going to be time pressure, but I think we do have to be sometimes, we do have to resist this idea that like things are less important, or like yeah, it is just about what emphasis you want to place. If you're going to do a Reformation inquiry, why can't it be a global Reformation inquiry? I mean, it's the same. It's just about how much detail you go into in certain things, right? So I think, yeah, I think it's definitely possible. But again, I've taught in schools that have 2 hours of Key Stage 3 a week, and now I'm in one that teaches 1 hour of Key Stage 3 a week, so I can only do half the amount of stuff. So, time pressure is definitely an issue. I do sometimes find students find the chronology quite difficult as well. Even though we've got these things like the integrated timelines, they can sometimes get a little bit confused, mainly because they compartmentalize stuff. But again, we should get them out of that habit, and I think that this is a useful way to do that. And yeah, there's actually the opportunity there of potentially changing exam modules. There is a Spain and the New World for EdXL, for example. This, if you want to maybe change it up a little bit instead of doing Elizabeth and the Revolts or whatever, you can do more of this, and therefore the Aztec unit, for example, might fit quite well. Or later on, if you've got like a kind of World War I unit with the Ottoman Empire appearing, then you might want to back project into earlier in the kind of specification down for Key Stage 3. So yeah, those are the 4 books in the series with the different types of global units that we have in them. So there's loads of stuff that you can use, and even if you don't have time to use them in your departments, I really do think that they are useful as kind of a basic narrative of actually for teachers as well to bulk up their knowledge on these different things, which no doubt most of us didn't learn when we were at school, and it has been broken down into something that's manageable for you to learn, and hopefully a jumping off point. That's what they're meant to be, springboards for us as teachers, and hopefully springboards for students as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think we'll wrap it up there. But thank you, and we will send the recording round and those other bits that we sort of discussed. So yeah, thank you very much, and hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thanks very much for coming, guys.
Bye.